joining me on a quilting tale today. This is Shaylin behind the camera. I'm in the middle of filming a tutorial on how I'm making a pieced backing for my latest top I finished with the Riley Blake Design Block Challenge, and it involves this free pattern, the pieced bird block from Riley Blake Designs. And I thought I'd make a video in between here showing how I change sizes of blocks. That's something I've mentioned in my Moda Blockheads quilt along that I'm doing as well. I've changed some sizes of Moda Blockheads 3 to fit in my Moda Blockheads 4 quilt if you're keeping up with my progress videos. And so, like I said, I thought I would just show you how to change block sizes going from smaller to larger and larger to smaller blocks. And I will use this one here because it's a free pattern online. I can put a link in the description box, but it's pieced bird block is what it's called. And so I'll show you how I will change the size and also some other considerations with the method that I use. So one thing you need to know is, are you dealing with a finished block size or unfinished size when you are going to do the quilt math for this? And so this is an 8-inch finished block size, and finished block size means it's all sewn into the top, so you don't have to account for your seam allowance when you're looking at the finished size. Unfinished would be 8.5 inches because you'd have a 1/4 inch on each side for the seam allowance. So unfinished is when it's not sewn into the quilt top, finished is when it is sewn in. Since this is 8-inch finished, I want to turn this into a larger block, a 16-inch block for the back of my quilt. And so I'm going to show you how I enlarge blocks using some quilt math here. Since I want to enlarge this block, we'll do the enlarge example first. So I have an 8-inch block currently, that's the finished block size, and I want it to be 16 inches finished for my new block. So I need to figure out how many times larger 16 is compared to 8, and I know that that's twice as large, it's 2 times larger. Now if you had something that wasn't as easy to do mentally, like let's say I had a 5-inch block and I wanted to turn it to a 12-inch block. Then what you would do is you would divide your larger size by the smaller. So I'd do 12 divided by 5. And it would be 2, and I could say 4/10 or just 2.4 because that's what you'll use on the calculator. 4/10 times larger. Okay, so whatever you do, just take the larger size divided by the smaller, and that tells you how many times larger it is. Now, for fraction's sake, for cutting things out and not dealing with funky fractions, it is much easier to use numbers that are multiples or factors of each other. For example, 8 is a factor of 16. It goes into 16 evenly. I could do 4 as well, a 4-inch block to a 16-inch block, and that would work out nicely with the fractions. Since 5 doesn't go into 12 evenly, you're going to get the funky fractions, as I call them, where they might not be as easy to cut. It's still doable, but you might not have the markings on your ruler, and it'll just be a little more complicated. So something to keep in mind too is try and find blocks that have a compatible factor or multiple in them. Let's go back to the block I'm working on now, going from 8 to 16 inches. I need to figure out now what size to cut all my pieces to. And I've done it here already. I'm going to show you where I get all my numbers here. But basically I want to subtract a 1/2 inch from every piece they want me to cut, and that's because the 1/2 inch is my seam allowance. I don't want to double my seam allowance I need to keep it at a 1/2 inch, so I have a 1/4 inch on each side of the piece to sew into the block. So I'm going to subtract a 1/2 inch first, then I'll take what's left and double it. So we'll subtract a 1/2 inch, then we're going to double it, again because this block is 2 times as large. If you were doing the 5 to 12 inch, I would multiply by 2.4 or whatever your, however many times bigger the larger block is. And then the third step is going to be to add that 1/2 inch seam allowance back in. So you can see how I did that in some of these here. Let me zoom in. And again, this is a free pattern, so I'm showing the measurements here. For piece A, I need 1 2 3/4 by 4 inch if I were going to do the 8 inch block. To get the 16 inch amount, I'm going to take 2 3/4, or yeah, 2 3/4, 2.75, 0.75 is 3/4, subtract that 1/2 inch seam allowance. So here's that finished size of 2 1/4, but I want to double it because I'm going to 16 inch size. So now I have 4 1/2, and I need to add that 1/2 inch seam allowance back in. So I need it to be 5 inches instead of 2 3/4. So that's where I got 5 inches. Same thing with 4, and some of these you might be able to do mentally. If I have 4 inches, I subtract, here's my little reminders off to the side here, I subtract a 1/2 inch, so that would be 3 1/2. 3 1/2 times 2 is 7, plus the 1/2 inch is 7 1/2. So I get a 5 and 7 1/2 inch piece. And so I just did that for all of these. And the nice thing, this goes all the way to V as far as pieces. There's a lot of them. And so once you've done it for a few, like 2 1/2 appears here, and I figured out it was 4 1/2, and then I can just plug that in again. I don't need to recalculate. So a lot of these had duplicate sizes. So even though there's lots of pieces, it didn't end up being a ton of extra math. It was 1 3/4. You can see that appears lots of times here. So that gave me my pieces. And with this bird, the piecing looks pretty straightforward. I haven't put it together yet. You can see, in fact, I just finished cutting out all my pieces here. But with this bird, most of the pieces, especially the background, look like nothing's really going to change with them. There's a few that look like they use a stitch and flip method in here. And so that will still work out. If you notice like T and V here, if I'm looking at the rectangle B that was originally here, I can see that B should be 4 1/2 inches tall. So if I go and look at the V piece that's going to be attached to it, I can see I have 4 1/2 by 4 1/2 inch piece here. So I know I'm in good shape because the width of the block is consistent. Now something to keep in mind, because none of these are trimmed down pieces, but you will encounter some blocks that you might need to trim down. And so you might be able to make your pieces a little larger and trim them down, especially if you have a funny fraction. So this is another free pattern. This is from Moda Blockheads 3, and this is a block I did earlier called Star Chain by Corey Yoder. And it comes in 6 inch, 8 inch, and 12 inch block sizes, and I wanted a 9 inch to fit with Moda Blockheads 4, which I'm currently working on, but I wanted to swap this. And so this one had pieces that you have to trim down. Same thing if you get half square triangles. Some methods, the pattern, you trim it down and it is exactly the size it's supposed to be, and some pattern writers make the pieces bigger and you trim them down. So in those cases where it involves trimming down, you want to look at some neighboring blocks that you know the for sure finished size. So in this one here, block H is just a square, and I did the same math to figure out, come down here, block H with my calculations here is 2 3/4 inches, a 2 3/4 inch square. So I know that when I'm making this unit here above this H square, I know that the width of this unit is going to need to be 2 3/4 when it's unfinished, or 2 1/4 when it's sewn in for the finished size. So I'll show you some pictures I took when I cut this, because when I did the math for the E, D, and F and G pieces, they were larger than they needed to be, but I could trim it down. When I trimmed a 1/4 inch away from these points here, I left the 1/4 inch seam allowance so that they would just have this clean point when it was sewn in to the finished size. It was the size of the H block, so I was able to trim it down to the H size and still have a 1/4 inch seam. The math still worked, but it looked kind of funny before I trimmed it down. And so that's just something to keep in mind with half square triangles or hourglass blocks or any units where you're trimming something down to size. The pieces might not look exactly like they're supposed to until you trim it down. Again, I use the same method, except this time, since I was taking the 6-inch size and enlarging it to 9, I took my larger size, divided it by 6, and I got 1.5 times as large. And so instead of multiplying by 2 like I was doing, I subtracted the 1/2 inch seam allowance, multiplied that by 1.5, and then added the 1/2 inch seam allowance. And that's how I got all these numbers off to the side and was able to make that block. So you can see there were some funkier fractions in this one, like 2 3/16 inches. And again, if it's something you can trim down, you might be able to take it up to like 2 1/4 instead of 2 3/16, something that's easier to cut. So just something to keep in mind when you have to trim down. Let's talk about reducing block sizes now. Going from a larger block size to a smaller. Just like before, you want to make sure you're dealing with finished sizes or unfinished sizes. It doesn't matter which, just as long as you're being consistent. And so to reduce, you're still going to find out how many times larger the larger size is than the smaller one. So for example, if I want to take a 12-inch block and reduce it down to 9 inches, I'm still going to do the same thing to figure out how many times larger 12 is than 9. So I'm going to do 12 divided by 9. And it's 1 1/3 times as large. Because it's 0.3 repeating infinitely, you could just put 1.33333, you know, as many times as you can fit it on your calculator, and it's going to get you pretty close. But I would say that 12 is 1 1/3 times as large as 9. And so I'll use the same method. I'm going to take the larger size and subtract your 1/2 inch seam allowance. But this time I'm going to divide by 1 1/3 in my example. So I'm not trying to enlarge it and multiply. I want to make it smaller and reduce it by 1 1/3. So I'll take whatever number I have minus 1/2 and then divide that by 1 1/3. And then I will add the 1/2 inch seam allowance back. So same idea, except when you're reducing, you're dividing, you're getting smaller. When you're enlarging, you're going to multiply and get a larger size. But everything else is the same. If we take a look at Corey Yoder's blocks here, because there's already some math done in here, we can see this in effect. So if we wanted to take, for example, her 12-inch size and reduce it to 6 inches, we can test the math here to see if it works. So I know that 12 divided by 6 is 2, so I'm going to divide by 2 here. So if I have my 2-inch square and I want to reduce it to 6 inches, 2 minus the 1/2 inch, and now divided by 2, because it's 2 times as small, and then add that 1/2 inch back in for the seam allowance. My square should be 1 1/4. And when I look at the 6-inch size here, I can see it's 1 1/4. So you can see this math method playing out here. I used it to also help me see, you know, if these fractions didn't work out exactly using this math, I knew that there was probably extra fabric there to trim down. So this method works really well when you're just dealing with squares and rectangles and pieces that aren't going to be altered too much, but pay attention to the pattern and see if it tells you to trim it down, or pay attention to what the pattern tells you to trim the unit size down to, and use this method to figure out what your new unit size should be. And then you can see if the individual pieces that make up that unit seem larger or like they'd be bigger than that. That suggests you're going to have to trim it down to that unit size. I hope that helps you see that it's not too intimidating to change a block size and that it can be done. These are the 2 blocks that were part of Moda Blockheads 3 that I wanted to enlarge to fit the 9-inch Moda Blockheads 4 size. And so I used the methods I just demonstrated to enlarge both of these, and they turned out really nice. You can see this one has a ton of half square triangles, and so I just was able to trim them all down to size, and it worked out nicely. So don't be afraid to give it a try if you're making especially a sampler style quilt and there's a block you really like and you'd like to put it in there. Try to enlarge or reduce it and see what happens. And if you're interested in seeing how my Riley Blake design pieced bird block comes along as it's enlarged and how it fits into the backing of the quilt top I just finished, be watching for that video. Like and subscribe so you don't miss when that video shows up. Thank you so much for watching.